Chapter 3. The Great Hall. Smoke from the battlefield rose with the sun, carrying the stench of burnt flesh and scorched armor. Kethan watched his soldiers move among the fallen, all craftsmen of Bogan conquered worlds, cannon fodder pressed into service far from home. Not a true Bogan or force-sensitive among them, as expected. The family crests on their armor sigils told the story, Clan Drazek Shun, with their horned masks split by red lightning, and Corvallis with its fractured black sun and 6 rays. These wounded would receive medical attention. The Bogan wouldn't afford such mercy to captured Ashla. Only death or worse awaited their enemies. But the Ashla clung to their humanity, believing mercy could coexist with passion, jealousy, even hatred. Balance. That's what they strove for, what defined them in a galaxy that seemed determined to choose between absolutes. What had the enemy learned from this first probing attack? That was the question that mattered now. "Sergeant," Kethan called, wiping battle grime from his lightsaber hilt. "Assemble the house leaders in the war room." The sergeant nodded crisply. Kethan turned to Captain Keen Kwana, who stood watching the bramble line with suspicious eyes. "Keep watch for the next wave. When it comes, notify me immediately." The bunker beneath the great tower served as their command center, connected to the battlements by reinforced corridors that had withstood centuries of conflict. Kethan descended into its familiar darkness, his eyes adjusting to reveal the tactical holotable where his war council waited. Mira stood closest to the display, still radiating the controlled rage that made her so effective in battle. Beside her, the Runa twins, Ballora and Ferris, represented House Visser-Rune, one of the few great houses not led by a Resha or Ashla. Both warriors carried themselves with the easy confidence of those who had earned their commands through victory in battle rather than birthright. High Warden Ashira Deven commanded attention even in the bunker's dim light. Her reputation for tactical innovation was legendary, particularly her integration of local fighting styles with traditional Terraskazi forms. Beside her, Madame Juno Fen studied the holo display with calculating eyes. Where Ashira conquered through strength, Juno preferred the subtler arts of intelligence and misdirection. Valka leaned against the far wall, his grey robes marking him as neither fully light nor dark. His victory over the Cordon Horde at Quarter 6 had become the stuff of legend. 12-to-1 odds overcome through tactical brilliance that turned chaos into decisive advantage. General Goji Khan straightened as Kethan entered, the scarred armor of House Shenkai gleaming in the hollow projector's blue light. He greeted his lord and commander. "Brother." "Brother," Kethan answered. Though not related in flesh, Goji had earned his rank and kinship through decades of innovation and audacity. Their family's bond ran deep, forged while battling side by side in the fires of the Scarsaw conflicts on Goji's homeworld. "Status," Kethan said without preamble. "Probing attack," Goji replied, his weathered face grim. "They tested our defenses, response times, coordination between houses, typical Bogan." Kethan nodded in agreement. "Weaknesses they identified?" Ashra looked the others in the eyes. "The hall's entrance." Ashra's voice cut through the bunker's recycled air. "No traditional gates, minimal choke points. From a military perspective, the monks built a temple, not a fortress." Kethan nodded. They'd erected barriers and obstacles, but the fundamental flaw remained. The gateless entrance to the walls surrounding the Great Hall was a gaping wound in their defensive line. "Suggestions?" Kethan asked. Valka pushed off from the wall, his movements carrying the fluid grace of a master swordsman. "We go offensive, hit them in the bramble before they reach our barriers, disrupt their timing, force them to react instead of execute." "My forces will support the advance," Ashira added. "Leave skeleton crews on the walls. Concentrate our strength where it matters most." Juno spoke from the shadows. "My network intercepted communications, references to enhanced assets, and genetic modifications. The Bogan aren't just bringing conventional forces. The temperature in the bunker seemed to drop several degrees. Enhanced assets meant war beasts, worse than those they had just encountered, creatures twisted by dark-side alchemy into killing machines. Kethan had faced them before and tried not to remember. "Very well," Kethan said finally. "We attack." "Contact!" Quinquana's voice abruptly cut through the comm static with professional calm. "Multiple formations massing beyond the tree line. Estimate 300 or more," he continued. "En route," Kethan replied, watching the War Council disperse like shadows fleeing dawn. Each leader moved with the fluid purpose, their boots echoing against stone corridors that had seldom witnessed moments of conflict such as these. Valka emerged first into the pale morning light, 24 Reisha flowing behind him like a tide of controlled violence. Their lightsabers ignited in sequence, azure, emerald, purple, each blade a star born from the darkness. They advanced toward the Na'ari bramble at a measured pace, weapons casting shifting patterns of light across ground already consecrated by the night's scrimmage. Behind them, Ashira positioned her forces with the meticulous placement of a master tactician. Crestmen and Ashla warriors formed overlapping fields of fire, creating a killing ground before the monastery's gates. Every angle calculated, every weakness covered. The gap Valka's advance had created would become a funnel, one that would channel enemy forces into a carefully prepared ambush. The halfway point between wall and tree line had become sacred ground, the place where adversaries met to test their resolve against each other. As Valka's fighters reached that invisible boundary, the bramble disgorged its contents like a wound splitting open. Clan foot soldiers poured forth, not warriors, but desperate souls pressed into service, carrying weapons they barely understood in service of causes that would forget their names before their blood had dried. They came in waves, screaming battle cries that spoke more of terror than courage, rushing toward death with the fatalistic determination of those who had already lost everything that mattered. The collision was inevitable as gravity. Lightsabers carved brilliant arcs through the morning air, while clan vibroblades rang desperately against the Ashla sabers. Blaster fire erupted from the enemy ranks in undisciplined volleys, more noise than precision. Valka's Reisha moved through the enemy ranks like predators among prey, each strike economical, purposeful, final. From the battlements, Juno's marksmen delivered immediate relief to advancing Bogan troopers with mechanical accuracy. Mira and the Runa twins had descended to the battlefield, their blades screaming in the universal language of aggression. The engagement lasted perhaps 20 minutes, an eternity for those dying, an instant in the greater scope of war. Kethan observed from the wall's height, his commander's eye cataloguing details that would prove crucial in the after-action analysis. Second wave. Still no Bogan leadership. No enemy Reisha among the fallen. Just expendables, meat thrown at walls to test their strength. The strategy of war demanded such sacrifices, but the pattern suggested something more sophisticated than simple attrition. Something deliberate. Something sinister. "Brother!" Gojikan's voice came over comms, carrying an edge that spoke to years of tactical experience. "This isn't right. Too easy. Too obvious." Before Kethan could respond, the world shifted beneath them. Not the tremor of artillery or the thunder of approaching vehicles, but something deeper, primal. The earth itself seemed to convulse with rage, sending warriors on both sides stumbling to their knees like supplicants before an angry god. The vibration moved with purpose, approaching from the north, passing beneath the monastery's foundations, continuing toward. Understanding struck like lightning. "Valka! Goji!" Kethan's voice cut across the command frequency, override authority demanding immediate attention. "They're tunneling under us. The Great Hall is the target. Move now." The enemy's plan was being executed with devastating precision, and the Ashla had been looking in entirely the wrong direction. All other positions! Maintain the line! Kethan barked into his comm as he sprinted down the stone steps from the battlements, taking them 3 at a time. Kethan and a handful of his men approached the sealed doors of the great hall, their boots echoing against ancient stone that had witnessed 1,000 years of prayer and contemplation. From within, they could hear the clash of battle, the sharp crack of blaster fire mixing with the distinctive hum of lightsabers and the guttural war cries of Bogan warriors answered by the disciplined shouts of Alani monks. The monks were well trained despite their distaste for violence, conflict, and war. When pressed to defend their sanctuary, they possessed extreme skills in hand-to-hand combat, as well as mastery of centuries-old Alani weapons that could match any modern blade. But they were trapped in the Great Hall, nowhere near the armory where their traditional weapons waited in careful storage. They had gathered at the direction of the house leaders to meditate in peace and avoid the conflict that raged beyond these walls. They carried nothing more dangerous than tokens of their studies and mastery of ancient subjects and ceremonial staffs. How would they fare against the advanced weaponry and dark force techniques of the Bogan? "Blast this door now!" Kethan barked to 2 soldiers nearby as Goji Khan and Valka arrived at his shoulder. The explosive charges detonated with a thunderous roar that sent debris from around the door flying in all directions, but the durasteel portal remained intact, scarred but unbroken. The door to the sacred hall had been designed to withstand siege weapons, not simple battlefield ordnance, designed to deny any trespassers not worthy to enter. "Again!" Kethan commanded, but the second blast proved equally useless against the reinforced barrier, even as the sounds of desperate battle continued to echo from within the hall. Valka lunged forward, his lightsaber igniting with a snap hiss that cut through the smoke. He drove the azure blade deep into the thick metal, the plasma edge melting through layers of durasteel like a hot knife through frozen butter. Goji mirrored his movements on the opposite side, his own weapon casting steady light as he slowly moved his metal-burning blade in a deliberate arc to meet Valka's cutting line. The gathered forces behind Kethan readied themselves as the 2 glowing arcs drew closer together, weapons primed and nerves stretched taut as bowstrings. Every warrior knew that the next few moments would determine whether they faced a rescue operation or a recovery mission. "Almost!" Valka called out, sweat beading on his forehead from the intense concentration required to maintain such precise control. But suddenly, silence fell beyond the doors like a burial shroud. The sounds of combat, blaster fire, shouted commands, the clash of blade against blade, simply stopped, as if someone had severed the connection between cause and effect. Goji glanced back at Kethan, reading the fear that flickered in his commander's dark eyes. But this wasn't fear of the enemy or the Bogan warriors they were about to face. This was fear of the silence itself, of what that terrible quiet might mean. Were all the monks dead? What scene of slaughter would greet them when the door finally fell? Goji and Valka reached out with the force, their combined power lifting and pushing the 2 massive metal slabs that had been carved from the Great Hall's doors inward. The sections fell away with resonating crashes that echoed through the monastery like funeral bells. Darkness waited beyond the threshold. Valka led the charge into the Great Hall, his lightsaber casting eerie blue light across stone that had been consecrated by centuries of peaceful meditation. The rest of Kethan's force streamed in behind him, weapons raised and senses straining for any sign of threat. They braced themselves for pitched battle or horrific carnage, but found themselves completely unprepared for what actually lay before them. 3 gaping holes scarred the hall's floor, massive excavations large enough to fly a small fighter into, where something had burrowed up through solid earth and the centuries-old cut stone that served as the foundation. The great hall stood empty except for 2 wounded monks near the far wall. One, his robe stained with blood from a blaster burn across his shoulder, supported his companion, who had taken more serious damage, a lightsaber wound that had carved a blackened line across his ribs. They looked up at their rescuers with expressions that mixed relief with something far more troubling. the hollow-eyed shock of men who had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of the galaxy itself. Kethan and the others rushed to their aid, but even as they applied field dressings and administered pain relief, a single question burned in every mind present. Where had everyone gone? As if reading Kethan's thoughts, the wounded monks began to speak, their voices carrying the hollow tremor of men who had witnessed something that defied the natural order of things. The earth. It split open like a wound, the first monk whispered, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. Boar worms, he continued, still half in shock, but not like any creature we'd studied in the archives. These were giants mutated by dark side alchemy into something obscene, large enough to swallow a fighter ship, two, whole, with tentacles that writhed like the arms of a Summa Verminoth. His voice cracked. They snatched our brothers from the floor, pulled them down into the darkness while they still breathed. The second monk, his lightsaber burn still weeping through the field dressings, took up the account with the unemotional clarity of someone forcing himself to remember every detail. The Bogan came through the tunnels behind their beasts, force users but also others, creatures we couldn't identify. They subdued everyone they could reach, bound them with energy restraints. They wanted prisoners, not corpses. No one dared breathe for fear they might miss a word or a precious clue being recounted by the survivors. We managed to wrestle lightsabers from two of their force sensitives, the first monk continued, his hand moving unconsciously to the ceremonial staff that had become his weapon. Fought them off long enough for the worms to retreat, but by then, he gestured helplessly at the empty hall. 75 of our brothers, gone. The three house lords stood in stunned silence, the implications of what they'd heard pressing down on them like the weight of a collapsed star. This wasn't conquest or revenge, this was harvesting. Human beings collected like rare specimens for purposes that could only be imagined. Kethan motioned toward the wounded monks, and medics moved forward with kind efficiency. Soldiers helped the survivors to their feet, supporting them as they were led away to proper medical care and the kind of debriefing that might help make sense of the impossible. They came specifically for the monks, Valka wondered aloud, trying to reconcile tactical doctrine with horrific reality. Wanted them alive? For what purpose? Before Kethan could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the violated chamber. The young monk acolytes, who had been outside the Great Hall when the attack began, had never made it to the Great Hall. They entered slowly, their eyes taking in the scene of devastation, the gaping wounds in the ancient floor, the scorch marks on walls that had stood for a millennium, the lingering stench of alien biology and dark side power. Their faces revealed a terrible innocence, minds struggling to comprehend the transformation of their sacred space into a battlefield. Most had been brought to the monastery when they were no more than 8 years old, spending the last decade mastering the Alani defensive combat arts. Though still young, these were warriors who had dedicated an average of 10 years to perfecting technique and power. But their training had focused on the physical disciplines, rather than the emotional mastery their elders possessed, the very wisdom that would have helped them process the carnage unfolding before their eyes. The apparent leader of the acolytes, a young man whose ceremonial robes marked him as among the most skilled of his generation, dropped to his knees in the center of the hall. His shoulders shook with grief that had no filter, loss that had no name. Valka moved to comfort the group, his grey robes a bridge between the light they had known and the darkness they now faced. "Your teachers live," he said simply, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen death in all its forms and knew the difference. "They were taken, not killed. Hope remains." He paused. "We'll do everything we can to bring them home." Valka hated making promises he wasn't certain he could keep, but faced with the raw anguish in the young monk's eyes, hope was the only shield he could offer against their grief. The sound of boots on stone announced new arrivals. Ashira and Juno entered the Great Hall, their expressions shifting from tactical assessment to something approaching horror as they absorbed the scope of what had occurred. The precision of the attack, the surgical removal of specific targets, the implications for their broader defensive strategy, all of it crystallized in the empty space where 75 lives had simply vanished. They approached Goji and Kethan with the measured steps of battle-hardened commanders facing something beyond ordinary warfare. "The remaining forces have retreated," Juno said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone reporting tactical data to avoid thinking about its implications. "I imagine shortly after the fighting here subsided." Kethan nodded grimly. "This changes everything," Ashira said quietly, her tactical mind already working through the ramifications. "If they can deploy boar worms of this magnitude, if they're harvesting Alani monks..." She didn't finish the thought, didn't need to. Valka rejoined the group. Juno spoke. "If I may." Kethan nodded. "I have a spy that needs to be extracted from Bogan space. She may have more information, missing pieces to this growing puzzle." Kethan turned to Valka. "You game?" Valka nodded. "I have just the team in mind. Send me the mission package." The group stood in silence, processing the past 24 hours' events. Then Kethan spoke up. "The rest of us will return to the coalition of the great houses and let them know what happened here, what this may mean for our fragile peace with the Bogan." Turning to his sister, "Mira, head to the nearest monk sanctuary on Onusa. Warn them. Prepare them." Juno's calculating eyes swept the ruined chamber once more before settling on Kethan. "Whatever they're building with these captives," she said, with the cold certainty of someone who understood the deranged currents of dark side genetic alchemy, "it's going to make our current problems look like a training exercise." The group departed, each Ashla leader carrying the weight of what they had witnessed, scenes now etched into their collective consciousness, driving urgent calculations about capabilities, countermeasures, and the terrible implications of what the enemy might be planning, each scattered to their appointed task with the urgency of those who understood that time had become their enemy. Soon, Ashla ships darted off into hyperspace like arrows loosed from a cosmic bow. Mira remained behind with the practical business of the living. She and her co-pilot worked with methodical efficiency to ensure the surviving monks could function in the aftermath of catastrophe. Leadership in crisis was often about the small details. Who would coordinate food distribution? Who would handle communications? Who would keep the young from drowning in their grief? In time, with the job complete, it was time for Mira to leave. She looked for Avon, now the leader of the monks, and found he had returned to the Great Hall, as if trying to heal his trauma through exposure to the very place where it had occurred. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice her approach. When she spoke, it was with gentle warmth and empathy, emotions that felt foreign on her tongue. "You have 2 of your masters here," she told Avon. "They will help you lead. When I reach Onusa, I'll have them send more masters as well." Avon's eyes swept the devastation around him. The gaping wounds in the ancient floor where something monstrous had torn through centuries of sacred stone. The scorch marks on walls that had stood for a millennium. "Why did this happen?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mira had an answer. The Bogan, greed, selfishness, envy, hatred, all the poisons of the dark side flowing through those who chose imbalance over harmony. But she held her tongue. When she finally spoke, after a moment of silent reflection, her voice was softer than intended. "You'll all be all right. You'll see." The Great Hall, once a sanctuary of peace and contemplation, now bore the scars of violation that would never fully heal. Young Avon's shoulders carried the weight of sudden responsibility, the burden of shepherding his brothers through grief deeper than any other they had experienced in their young lives. The young monk nodded, understanding passing between them. He was inheriting a broken sanctuary, but it could be rebuilt. The alternative, abandonment, was unthinkable. Then the last of the Ashla to depart, Mira left Thylos's atmosphere in her 2-person fighter, carrying news that would change everything for those wise enough to listen. "Jules," Mira said to her co-pilot, "set our course for Onusa." Thylos fell away behind them, another warning the great houses could no longer ignore. As the course was set and the pair jumped to hyperspace, Mira wondered how many other worlds were facing similar horrors at this very moment. But one thing was certain: a conflict that would test every alliance, every principle, every soul in Ashla space was coming, whether they were ready or not.